Starting okay. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for this program. Dan Brockett, who is an SOS board member and the chair of our education committee, and Frank Riley, another SOS board member and our outstanding tour guide. Both have done extensive research about the National Park Seminary faculty members that they are going to share with you now. So I will mute myself so you two can get going.
Okay. Since there aren't too many of us, I mean, I'm okay if people want to jump in with questions, or are you muting them all, Bonnie? Is it automatic mute? No, you're muted.
You're muted. Can't hear you.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to be too formal, I don't think, just unless you want to really discuss something, and then maybe we should wait until afterwards. But boy, it takes the pressure off when you don't have 100 people in the room all staring at you. So yeah, I'll try and take a little more casual approach, but get the information across. I'm pretty sure most of you know the history of National Park Seminary, that it was a girls' finishing school for the wealthy, the wealthier level of students, female students. It was in business from 1894 through 1942. And tonight, rather than focusing on the students, which is often what we do, we're going to talk about the instructors. And for the most part, we're going to focus on the early presidency under President Cassidy and his principal wife, Vesta. And they managed the school from 1894 to 1916. The teachers that we selected out of the hundreds who passed through the school over the years, the selections were made based on if they were at the school for a very long time, or what influence they had over the school, or perhaps they were influenced by their time there. And to some extent, because we had to do a lot of historical research, it was based on who we could find the most about that made for an interesting story. So it's a little haphazard, but some of these folks are really instrumental in the history of the school. So, as I said, the school opened in 1894 under the direction of John Cassidy, president, and Vesta Cassidy, who was the principal. They were both graduates of Ohio Wesleyan University, and between the two of them had quite a good amount of teaching experience, including running a girls' school in Norfolk, Virginia, right before coming to National Park. The first catalog, oops, hopefully I can switch slides. There we go. Yeah, so this is the catalog pages of showing the faculty from the first catalog, which is actually from their second year of operation. You'll see it's for the previous year, 1894-95, right there. And I wanted to show you this because it shows the types of classes that were being offered in the very earliest years of the school, as well as the qualifications of some of the instructors. So you can have a look at that and get a sense of what was taught. A lot of standard offerings, math and English, French conversation, science, also a lot of music courses and art as well. And by the time we get to a couple, several years later, 1912 to 13, we've got not just 3 pages of class offerings, but 6 pages of faculty listed. So definitely an expansion in what was being offered and the number of faculty being employed here. Interestingly, and we'll talk about some of the music faculty later, but the music faculty gets a whole page and a half. So they really did have, actually, I think, yeah, page and a half of music faculty. And this is a report card, which shows everybody got the same report card, and they just gave a grade for which subjects they were taking that term or that year. This student was somewhat mediocre. She got a lot of S pluses, S minuses, and C. And you can see the kind of arbitrary grading that National Park Seminary used in its early years. They did not give exams. They thought that a student should be able to answer questions accurately on the spot. So they would, give them oral pop quizzes and expect them to know the material in the classes. So they did not get your standard ABC type grades. And the faculty who taught here would have had to embrace this kind of approach to education, which wasn't standard, certainly wasn't academically as rigorous as some of the other institutions. So it does mean that the faculty came from maybe a different side of things than your strictly academic type faculty. So Frank is going to give us a little bit of background on, he sort of crunched the numbers, so to speak, of the faculty and analyzed it a little bit to give us a sense of who was here.
So everyone who knows me will be shocked to learn that I'm working on a spreadsheet of all the faculty for all the years that we have, which is the sort of thing I do in my copious free time. But I had been working on that a little before, but that includes all the administrators and all the staff whose names appear in each catalog, not just faculty. So I sort of had to recast it a little bit, and that's a laborious project. So what I have to manipulate to do the statistics, I just picked the first 12 years completely arbitrarily. That's half of the time that Mr. Cassidy was the president of the school. And during those first early 12 years, as you see, I should say, if pressed under oath, it would be very difficult for me to give you a definition of who's in the faculty and who's not, because they have a lot of sort of mixed job descriptions in the catalogs. And I think that ultimately it's sort of they're in the faculty if I decided that they were. So sorry, but I can talk at length about why I think one job is not faculty and another job is. That would be complicated, and I don't think it would help. So, given my sense of who's in the faculty, there were 119 total. I was a little surprised, and was not. 83% of the faculty of the first 12 years were women, leaving only 99, and leaving the remaining 20 were men. And a bit of a surprise, but I'm going to reveal why that's not as surprising as it may seem. The average term of service of each faculty member, because there was a lot of turnover, as you can imagine, and all academic institutions deal with that, was 2.5 years each per faculty member. Okay, next. So here's unpacking a little bit about that term of service, which I found interesting. And the math doesn't work. There's a trick because we don't have one of the catalogs. So forgive me if things don't add up properly. There are reasons for that. So nobody served for 12 years. They served for 11 years because there's a year missing. So the people who were there the whole time was 6 people, including the 2 Cassidys who I counted as faculty. Then only 1 person for 9 years, 1 person for 8 years. And then as you read on down, when you get closer, you see 59 of the people who were listed out of that 119, which is almost exactly half, were only on campus 1 year. That was really quite typical. And if you stayed longer than 1 year, you might last 3, but not very many people lasted longer than 3 years. And I think that, as I said, is sort of typical. Another way to look at it is, and this is what my spreadsheet is for, and it's fun for me. What degrees do they have, and where do they go to school, that sort of thing. And as you'll see, it's a wide range. There was a doctor on campus. There was somebody who had a PhD, and there were a couple of people with law degrees. But more than half did not have a formal degree in the sense of having at least a bachelor's degree of one kind or another. And I lump them all together, of course: bachelor's of arts, bachelor's of science, philosophy, bachelor of philosophy, which is an older degree. The people who are listed as none, though, very many of them were listed as having graduated from an institution, just not listed as having a degree. So an example of that would be graduating from a conservatory of music, or in those days, a very popular pursuit was to go to what was called the normal school, which was essentially a teaching college. It's a college for teachers. When you graduated from a normal school, you didn't get a degree, you got a teaching certificate. And a lot of the faculty here at National Park Seminary had teaching certificates of one kind or another, or listed as attending XYZ normal school, comma, graduated. So that's sort of just an overview of what the faculty was like during the first 12 years. I have another spreadsheet. I mean, another piece of this same spreadsheet covers the subjects, which is something that I've now talked about more than once in these. And so I'm going to just read a few because they're really fun for me. Dancing and fencing, I think, is a good one. Lots of English teachers, as Ann already pointed out, lots of science, a fair amount of science, lots of French and German. No Spanish yet. The first Spanish teacher appears a few years after this. Also gymnastics, many piano teachers. They get a new piano teacher every year, it seemed like. And voice culture was a very big thing, art, but also some of the classes that you might expect in the context of a finishing school. So we have China painting and dressmaking, and my personal favorite, foreign travel. That you saw the example of a report card. That student had actually taken one of their foreign travel classes. History, but also history and mythology, which I think is a fun combination. Management of estates, what to do when you go back home and get married and your husband dies unexpectedly and leaves you with a huge amount of property. You have to know how to manage the estate. So you can take a class in that. And then, of course, one that I would have failed, penmanship. I had a class in that. So a really wide range of educational offerings, perhaps, as Ann said, not the most rigorous education in the world, but really wide ranging, and from a well-qualified faculty for the day. Remember, at this time, only 2% of males go to college. So now let's see, I guess, am I up again? Yes. So now we're going to talk about some of the specific members. And it was hard. I think it was, for me at least, it was very difficult to decide which way to do this, because there really are some very interesting faculty members, and some of whom we never hear about. Charlotte Priest is my favorite. And another way to look at the faculty is who are the people who really were the sort of heart and soul of the school. And I think it's easy to argue that ignoring the president and the spouses of the presidents, who were obviously owned by the school and were very involved, Charlotte is one of the two, I think, who are really the living heart of the National Park Seminary. And there she is, a picture of her in 1899. So she was born in 1870. She lived here locally. She had graduated from college at Columbian College, took a degree in English, and the year before 1894, when the school started. Columbian College is now what is the institution that eventually became George Washington University, and was looking for a job. We know the story. There was a man named Seymour Tulloch who had gotten together with 6 other individuals, one of whom owned the plantation called the Highlands. And the 7 of them pooled their money and bought 200 acres and built a hotel that opened in 1887 called De Forest Inn, when we're looking at the front porch of it. And the hotel closed in 1893. And Mr. Tulloch had communicated with Mr. Cassidy earlier. And so he changed his mind and said, yes, you can rent the hotel. And so the Cassidys came up from Norfolk, rented the Forest Inn, and in September of 1894 opened the National Park Seminary. Seymour Tulloch's father had a brother, and that uncle of Seymour Tulloch's had a daughter, and that daughter of Seymour Tulloch's uncle had a daughter. So I can never remember, second cousins, first cousins, 800 times removed. I never can get that right. But so there's a direct connection, and that girl was named Mary Charlotte Priest. She had graduated from school, and at the time, Anne didn't show the original catalog before the first year catalog. They didn't have an English teacher, and that's the most important faculty member, I think, in the school of this sort. Every student who goes to a school like this is going to read Hawthorne and going to read Shakespeare and going to read Longfellow, that sort of thing. So the teacher of English is probably the key slot. And they didn't have an English teacher. So Mr. Tulloch said to Mr. Cassidy, well, my cousin, however many times removed, is looking for a job as an English teacher. Why don't you talk to her? And embellishing the story, I don't know if this is true. I think they sort of hired her as a stopgap. They had to have an English teacher, and it was getting time for the school to open. So they hired Charlotte Priest, whose name is actually Mary Charlotte Priest, but she called herself Charlotte M. Priest. And I doubt very seriously that they expected it to last very long, particularly after then she immediately gets into trouble by having this secret literary society, which eventually would flower under Mrs. Cassidy to become the sorority system. Charlotte Priest is the one who started that. And it turned out, and I always get a little misty-eyed when I think of this is the only job she ever had. She died teaching English to the girls at National Park Seminary in 1929. And had a wonderful career and went on to get a master's degree from Columbia University, the one in New York, not Columbia College. Went on to become preceptress, which was one of the important administrative positions. And then even more importantly, the prefect of studies. She was the prefect of studies for many years. That was the senior administrative position held by a faculty member. Sort of like provost, I think, maybe, not sure about that. And then assistant dean. And this was the only place where she ever worked. And we have her letters and lots of things about her. She is, as I said, I think one of the two people who are the heart of the school. And there she is towards the end of her life. We have the wonderful funeral speeches that were made on the occasion of her funeral in 1929. And she's buried at Rock Creek Cemetery. So then much more briefly, here's Lucy Madeira, and she's listed again. One knows a little bit too much about her, perhaps. She's not obscure, but she's really interesting and important in my view, because she's one of the ones who is on the faculty for 1 year at her very first job during the time that the Cassidys rented the school and didn't own it. And we're operating on a shoestring because our dear friend, Mr. Tulloch, Charlotte Priest's cousin, who recommended her for her job, hadn't told the Cassidys that the property was under a mortgage that was going to come due in a couple of years, and they were in very real danger of losing their investment. So, and all the money that they'd spent on rent would have been thrown away. So they had to scramble, and they had to save every penny they could get their hands on. I think they would have, any kid of any age whose parents were willing to pay the tuition could come to National Park Seminary those first 3 years. And they didn't. So Lucy Madeira came from a family that had difficulties. Her father was a Civil War veteran who had tuberculosis, lived in Washington from about 1880. No, I'm sorry, I don't remember what year they moved to Washington. They moved to Washington in 1887, same year that the hotel opened. And so she went to school. She got a loan to go to school and went to Vassar and graduated from Vassar in 1896 and was hoping to have a job at a good school here in Washington when there were two people up for the position, and the other one got a recommendation from the President of the United States. So that settled that deal. And I think he also might have been male, which sometimes is a problem. And so she was stuck and got a job teaching history at National Park Seminary, $150 a year. Also worked part-time at Sidwell Friends. And we have wonderful, she's our source for the, what it was like. I roomed and slept in a bed with a young teacher of music from Charleston, South Carolina. We did not have a closet for our clothes, nor a bureau, nor a chest of drawers, and we had only one dormer window in our tiny room. We kept our clothes in suitcases under the bed. I had 2 free hours in the week when I was not teaching, chaperoning, proctoring study hall, or doing clerical work in the office, or in addition, also preparing for the next day's teaching. So it was apparently just an arduous slog, which she talked about many times, but remembered fondly. But in the end, she, because of this part-time position she had with Sidwell Friends, she went there. It was her next job, and she taught full-time at Sidwell Friends for 10 years, and then borrowed considerable amount of money at the time, $5,600, to set up her own school. And she was candid about that. The reason she wanted to be the head of the school is because that's how you made money, and her family was depending on her. Her father had tuberculosis, one of her sisters had tuberculosis. She was the breadwinner for the whole family. And set up what became incredibly famous now as the Madeira School in Washington, later moved to McLean, and is still there, and is still a girls' school and well known, quite prominent. But I think of her as that 1 year living in a tiny room in the main building, teaching history and mythology to the girls of National Park Seminary, the third year of the school's in existence. Your turn, Anne.
My turn. Trying to switch slides. There we go. Our next feature, so to speak. And Frank, I have to commend you. That was the shortest amount of speaking about Charlotte Priest I think I've heard from you. I know that you admire. I know you admire her very much. And if we have time at the end, give us some more information.
Yeah, that was a real strain for me. Thank you.
So Frances Page Robinson, here she is in the 1899 photo, was hired in the first year the school operated, and she was hired to be the preceptress or head teacher, also an instructor of Latin and history. And I think later she mostly focused on Latin. She was a graduate of Hollins College, and after that she returned to her home in rural Virginia. And I looked it up on a map. It's in King William County, in the middle of nowhere. But she opened a school, the Mount Pisgah Academy for Girls. I'm guessing she didn't have enough students to make a go of it, because she moved fairly quickly to teach at Culpeper Institute and then went on to National Park Seminary in 1894. And she always lists herself in the catalogs as F. Page Robinson, but she was known to the faculty and to her friends as Fanny. According to a 1931 publication, she was a woman, quote, of gracious presence, and her charming conversation sparkled with delightful wit and humor. Her extensive travel in both America and Europe and her thorough knowledge of Latin and Roman languages made her a highly cultivated person. Her noble influence was felt wherever she was known. I just thought that was a nice statement about her. And her contribution to the school, and she was there for quite a few years. She had some responsibility in creating the Alumni Association. I don't know that it was her idea per se. I think that it may have come from the Cassidys, but she was in charge of making it work and administrating it when it first began. And we have copies, well, we have the letters that she wrote to students, sort of informing them of this new association. And they'll be getting more information in the mail, and she hopes that they will consider joining. And she would take their Alumni Association fees and that kind of thing. So, and this is important to us at SOS and to folks who live at the seminary property now, because the Alumni Association is really responsible for keeping the memory of the school alive long after it closed. And of course, it's because of their collections that we have the heart of our archival collections. So pretty important institution. We also, I also wanted to talk about Fanny because we also know about her long-term and really deep friendship with another professor at National Park Seminary, Ida Monroe. And Ida and Fanny were a team. They shared a birth date. They were both born on April 27th, 1845. And they were both there when the school opened, and they left the school together. And here is Ida, sitting right next to Fanny. And everybody at the school knew that they were a pair. I wouldn't call them a couple. I don't think that's accurate, but in the romantic sense. But they did room together, and they were very close. At one point, there's a letter where Fanny is writing to a former student, and she's saying how much she loves this dog that she just got. But when Ida returns from being away, she's going to make her get rid of the dog because she doesn't like dogs, and it might cause a divorce. So, you know, you can read into that what you will, but they were very tight. So Miss Ida Monroe was from Georgia, Putnam, Georgia, also the middle of nowhere. And she came to the school with the Cassidys. She had been on the faculty at the Norfolk School. So she came up with them. She had graduated from a teacher's college that became the University of Nashville with an LI degree. And I had to look that up. It's Licensure of Instruction, which was a new one for me. And she, like Fanny, returned home after she graduated, and she ran the Peach Orchard High School in Buena Vista, Georgia. She was the principal of the school and the only instructor for 14 male and 8 female students, and that was in 1878. She also traveled abroad, particularly in the summers, both as a scholar of French and German languages and as a chaperone for several students over the years. And when she wasn't traveling during the summers, she took students on at her home, her family home in Georgia. A local newspaper, very, very local, the Schley County News, they got the name of the school wrong. They called it the National University in Washington, D.C., and then later called it the Mountain Park Seminary, whatever. They did, I'm going to give them credit for what they said about her, which was that Miss Monroe is one of the brainiest women of the South and is an honor to her state. She also, in that 1931 publication, she was called a woman of poise, gracious presence, culture, refinement, engaging personality, and brilliant intellect. She left National Park permanently to move back to Georgia when her father became ill, and she took over the administration of the family's Springdale farm, which was reported as, quote, lucrative, and had a well-equipped dairy, which she conducted with eminent success. She brought Fanny Robinson with her to live out their years together. Oh, I forgot I had this picture of her as a child, but there they are again together outside of the seminary. Fanny wrote to a former student of their friendship that Ida's, quote, love is such a rare blessing to my life. Such a friend is not often found. And they were, in fact, buried next to each other on the Monroe family plot, the family cemetery in Georgia on the family farm, even though the Robinson family had a plot in the prestigious Hollywood Cemetery in Fanny's home state of Virginia. So I think that's a sweet, sweet image. So the important things to note about Ida and Fanny is that they really must have been some pretty incredible role models to the students. They were industrious, generous, kind, and witty intellectuals. Their friendship set an example for the students, but it also may hint at a difference from the late 19th and early 20th century and now. And that is really what it was like to be a single woman back then. The only position that was really open to a young woman who wanted or needed to work was teaching. I mean, if you were of a lower echelon, you could probably find factory work, but these young ladies were from fairly wealthy, well-off families. I wouldn't call them wealthy. So their only option was to become a teacher. And then if a teacher got married, she would almost invariably stop employment. And I think Frank's statistics showed that. The turnover of these young women was fairly rapid. And I suspect in a lot of instances, and we do know of some, it's because they got married. Another interesting footnote is that many of the teachers, including Ida and Fanny, kept up their employment during the summers. And I don't know if this is because they needed to or wanted to, but Fanny stayed on the NPS campus because she was responsible for showing it off to prospective students or to welcoming visitors. And Ida, of course, ran her summer school. And finally, they are representative of the deep friendships that were formed among the faculty members and the students, and between the two, faculty and students. That is emblematic of National Park Seminary. So let's jump over to another field of study and another set of faculty, and this is the Caspar clan. They were a family of musicians and were longtime instructors at the school, where musicianship was encouraged and very much part of the students' curricula. And there in 1899 is Annie Romer Caspar. She was employed at the seminary when it opened in 1894, as was her nephew, Anton. She was a professionally trained singer from Baltimore, and Anton was instructor of violin and mandolin. Annie's husband was Josef Caspar, and he's described as one of the most active professional musicians in late 19th century Washington. And so his family, the Caspars, had immigrated to Baltimore from the Czech Republic. His father was also a musician and worked at the Peabody Institute, which is where Josef started his professional career after he took his professional training in Prague at the conservatory. They moved to DC as a young family, and he was briefly the conductor at Ford's Theater. And then he became the conductor of the Georgetown Symphony Orchestra, which it started out as the Georgetown Amateur Orchestra. And an article I read said that they really were amateurish. And it was just a bunch of friends who took music lessons as kids and would get together. And he really transformed it into a performing company. He booted out anybody who couldn't really play. So they became fairly well known for their musicianship. And he was the conductor 1886 to 1894. He then founded and conducted the Washington Choral Society. He and his nephew, Anton, his son, Henry, and a non-family member, believe it or not, cellist, formed the Caspar Quartet. And they performed throughout Washington and were occasionally joined by the Caspar's daughter, Francesca, who was a soprano. So I did mention that they were a musical family. They really, really were. And here's just a small sampling of programs from the seminary. Josef came to the seminary in 1910 to join his wife, and they both were voice instructors. They called it voice culture. And then Henry joined the family at the school in 1914, teaching piano after he trained in Berlin and at the Royal Academy of Music in London. Again, no degrees are mentioned, like Frank said. It just says who they trained under, and from a 2021 perspective, I don't really know who that was, but I think they're name dropping. So I'm guessing that they trained under fairly prestigious musicians. Annie taught at the seminary for nearly 30 years until she passed away in 1923. Anton was there for over 40 years, retiring in 1927. Henry remained until 1931, after 17 years, but he was also occupied partly during that time by running his own school of music in Washington, D.C. And you can see these great images showing the types of training these students had to go through. And I did take piano as a youth. And if I had been blindfolded, I'm pretty sure I would have quit after 5 minutes of that. So kudos to that young lady. So the Caspars are part of this talk because I think they're very interesting. You know, they're an immigrant family and how they made it here in the area, and they were able to be musicians and didn't have to find other careers. And as an aside, I think it's interesting that Josef was granted a patent for inventing a device that would allow students of the violin or the viola to exercise their fingers without damaging the instrument and without having to carry it around. So they could carry this little portable fret and practice their finger work and finger strengthening. So I thought that was interesting. So again, it's only through the records of National Park Seminary that we have the opportunity to learn about this family, you know, otherwise might have gone unnoted in history. So, but they really did contribute a lot to the musical education of the students of NPS. And I think Frank is going to talk now about Mr. Partington.
Yeah, and I'll try to be brief about this one as well. This is a subject that really interests me, but unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of information readily available. Um, the surprising thing, so Frederick Eugene Partington, who was born in 1854, as it says there, in Maine, during the month of May in Maine. He was an accomplished student. He ends up getting his bachelor's degree at Brown University. And then he travels in Europe extensively researching European educational models, which is the sort of thing that a lot of people did in those years. If you couldn't get a job, but you had the means to do it, you could travel and gain experience. And then the idea was to take back from what you learn in Europe and see if it could be applied in the American context. So he spent considerable time in France and also some time in Germany. And then eventually when he comes back, he serves as the principal of the New Paltz Academy in New York for 3 years, and then gets a job and becomes eventually the headmaster and essentially president of the Staten Island Academy and Latin School for 12 years. So he's an accomplished educator. And the part of the story that I wish I knew better is how his connection arises in the context of National Park Seminary. He is brought to National Park Seminary earlier than I had originally thought, and I got to unpacking all the lists. He comes through the year 1907, 1908, which is just after all the first wave of the construction by the Cassidys is finished. The second half of the villa is built and the gymnasium is built, so the campus is essentially completed at that point. And he's brought in as in a new position called headmaster. And then you could argue about whether or not he's really faculty. I mean, he's in charge of the educational program at that level underneath under the supervision of the president. But he's not, in fact, as far as I know, teaching classes himself. He's an educational administrator. Early on in his career, I have to say, Anne found this, and I was really delighted. He wrote an article in 1895, published by the University of Chicago, on the problem of nomenclature in secondary schools, which is just the sort of thing that I'm railing about all the time, that high schools in America don't have any standard way of referring to the various classes. Senior, junior, freshman, that sort of thing, but also first form, second form, and two schools in the same neighborhood don't even have the same nomenclature, so nobody knows what they're talking about. He, of course, picks the one that he likes, which is the one that I think would be horrendous. So that's how it is in America. We all agree on the problem, but we never agree on what the solution ought to be. But happily, he lost and I won. So we do have freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors in American high schools. But his style of complaining about lack of American nomenclature uniformity sounds a lot like someone I know. So that was fun. So he rises eventually. He takes at National Park Seminary. He's there for several years and ends up being director. And his ascendancy essentially corresponds to Mr. Cassidy's waning. Mrs. Cassidy died in February of on Valentine's Day in 1910. And the next year, Partington is named director. And remarkably, that catalog, Mr. Cassidy's name almost doesn't appear. He's not listed as an administrator. He's just listed as one of the trustees. And he's not listed as president anymore, although he still has that job. And the next year, he returns back to the catalog as listed as president. But I think Partington essentially is running the show. And then he's still there when Mr. Cassidy finally, having remarried and no longer interested in the school much at all, really, it seemed apparently, sells his interest in the summer of 1916. And there's a Journal of Education article which says so the guy who bought the school was a man named Joe Trees from Pittsburgh, on the understanding that his partner, business partner in this regard, Dr. James Eli Ament, would be the new head of the school, the president of the school. And so two factors entered into Mr. Tree's decision to invest, and it was reportedly the most money that had ever been paid for a school at that time in America. The first was that Ament would be the president and would take charge of it. And secondly, the retention of Dr. Partington, the president director, who I don't think was a doctor, but that's all right, Miss Munford, the dean, more on her later, and the prefect of studies, Miss Priest, for the president. And Miss Priest would be there until she died in 1929. Miss Munford would be there until the school closed in 1942. But poor Dr. Partington is gone within 2 years of Miss Dr. Ament arriving. And Ann and I have talked about this. I had always sort of assumed that he wanted to be running the show, and when Ament arrived, Partington left in a huff. But Ann points out that he was already 24 years in service as the head of the school at that point, and had been, when Mr. Cassidy brought him to the campus, he had 10 years more experience at the job than Mr. Cassidy himself had. So, you know, at 60 something, which is not that old, but although life expectancy was shorter then, Mr. Partington may simply have retired, but he stayed in Washington and lived in a rather lovely house, and continued to be active in Washington for many years after that, for some years after that. He lived for another 8 years. But that was the end of his formal relationship. It was the end of his employment at National Park Seminary. So he is the transitional guy, in my view, if you're going to understand. And it's a piece that I didn't know anything about until I got to looking at it. He sort of bridges between Cassidy and Ament, with the help of the two most important people, in my view, Priest and one other. Anne?
Thanks for that nice segue. Yeah, I referred to them as the bookends. Charlotte Priest, who was there in the first year of the school through essentially until her death, and Catherine Munford, who came and overlapped with her for a decade and stayed until the very end of the school in 1942. And while they may have bookended the years of the school's operation, I don't think you could find two more different people. Charlotte, and you can kind of tell from that photo, and we know from records and letters that she was adored by the students, and she was a warm person, whereas Catherine Munford had more of a reputation as a disciplinarian and somebody who was by the book and really relied on rules. So, but she is obviously just as instrumental in the legacy of the school as Charlotte Priest. And interestingly, she came the same year as Partington, which I didn't know. Oh, and let me just flip sides. There she is. She came in 1907. So I wonder if the school, they had enough of a student body at that time that they realized they needed some more administrators. So maybe that's part of the reason they got Partington and Munford in 1907. And she was hired. She was the dean of the students, and I'm not positive that she came on as dean, but I'm pretty sure.
No. Her original title was preceptress.
Preceptress. Okay, so she was hired as preceptress, right? So she was from Sydney, Ohio. She went to public school, interestingly, under a principal named Ida Haslop, who was a formidable woman, and from whom Catherine may have gotten some of her traits. She was the first female principal in the state of Ohio. The two apparently formed a bond, and Catherine followed Haslop's example by getting her degree from the Illinois Wesleyan University, and then she followed Miss Haslop to Pueblo, Colorado, where Haslop had become principal of the public high school. Munford was a mathematician. She preferred geometry and took graduate coursework from Harvard in geometry. But she, like many teachers, had to double up. So she was the math teacher and also the gym coach for the girls. And here she is pictured with her high school, Central High School girls basketball team. It's a very grainy photo, I realize, but she's the woman holding the ball up between the two basketball captains. She was there at least 1895 through 1905. Those are the years I found records for her. She got we get inklings of her reputation as a more strict. I call her a prude. That sounds negative, and to some extent it is, but she really comes across as being very, I don't know, very protective maybe of young women. And at the school in Colorado, there was a newspaper article about her that said that the writers found it odd that she would not let anybody attend basketball practices or watch the girls at their gym class, because she was concerned about the decency of them in their gym uniforms and being seen by anybody. So she was protecting them from the sense of impropriety, the potential impropriety of having someone see them in their gym uniforms. So, I think that it's going to be a recurring theme throughout her career. I said she was there through 1905, but I did find that she was offered a position in 1907 to continue teaching, but that is the year she came to Forest Glen. So we know she left for that reason. We were talking earlier about who the teachers were in the earliest 20th century. And just as a point of reference, Catherine's school district in Colorado had a male superintendent, 2 male teachers, 2 married women teachers, and over 40 unmarried women as instructors while she was there. So she came to NPS in 1907, stayed until 1942, overlapping with Charlotte Priest. And she, helped bridge, like Charlotte, bridge the different school administrations through 3 presidents. She was a devout Methodist and began her career. Oh, that's right. She began teaching Bible literature. That was what she was teaching at the school, and then quickly became dean. With her strict requirements for etiquette, proper attire, and good behavior, she proved, as I said, the perfect counterpoint to Miss Priest, who was more than an instructor. She was a friend of the students. She was the disciplinarian of the school. If you got a note for something that you did wrong, some misdemeanor, it didn't say, please report to the principal's office. It said, please report to Miss Munford. And it was Dean Munford who meted out punishments, and also was responsible for meeting any young man who came calling at the school. They would have to pass muster with Miss Munford before a young lady would be allowed to see that gentleman. One story we have is a student who wrote that when they were getting ready to take the train to go into DC, and this is a quote, "The girls had to line up on the Honeysuckle Bridge and stand rigidly at attention while Miss Munford thoroughly inspected them. The girls had to wear black stockings, regulation shoes, and gloves. No girls were allowed to wear one glove and carry the other. Moreover, both gloves had to match. There was no fooling the dean." So it sounds a little like a military inspection, but that's Miss Munford for you. And here's a lovely little snippet I took out of a scrapbook from a student in 1918 when an actor and singer, Francis Wilson, came out to the school and gave a performance. She says that he sure created Pip and the girls, although he did shock Miss Munford when he sang, "Oh boy, what in the H blank do we care?" So what in the hell do we care? And apparently Miss Munford, hearing that, may have given her a little bit of a heartburn. And here in the following year, the same student taped into her scrapbook this thing, and I might have to actually blow up my screen so I can read it. It says, "I hereby promise to use my best efforts from today forward to remove from the vocabulary of this school the following objectionable words with their various compounds: G and jazz." So, and you can see the first signature on that list was Catherine Munford. So she was responsible for the lexicon at the school and making sure that, let me try and get the screen to shrink again. She was responsible for making sure that the girls were using proper grammar. The other picture on this page, which you can't see, and I can't seem to make my screen want to shrink, is the student saying that she, you'll notice, haha, notice my name isn't here. We've started another fraternity. However, in competition, the GTH frat, go to H with an exclamation point. So you can see that she was not having any of the banned words from her. She was not going to have words banned from her language. Let me see what I can do here. Hold on one second. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. And here is Miss Munford as she was a little bit older, and on the right is a picture of her with the last president of the school, Dr. Davis. And I'll just tell a final story about her. The villa with the dorm on the far side of the campus across the Glen was suffering from what the dean considered to be improper cleaning. So she was known to walk around the building and its balconies looking into the windows of the student dorms to make sure that their rooms were up to her standards. So when the girls who lived there found out, they started closing their curtains when they went out of their rooms. And well, when they came back from class one day, they found that their curtains were gone. So they were not allowed to have curtains from that point forward until they could prove that they could keep their rooms cleaned. And this garnered the dorm the nickname, the Villa for Villains. So that is how the villa was known. So she did maintain her, her distance from the students. I'll go back to her so we can just look at her. And I'm wrapping up, I promise. And she was cool, whereas Miss Priest was a warm-hearted person. But she really was not without affection for the graduates, and certainly she loved the school. She wrote in the 1940s, after the school had closed, the following. She says, "I believe you could endure a day in the infirmary or a night in the study hall just for the fun of being back with old friends. I believe you could listen to the hoot of a B&O engine and call it music, if only you could swing over the bridges in the moonlight and find your sorority house as you left it. Ah, those were happy days." So I think that is really the sentiment of many of the faculty and certainly the students at National Park Seminary. They were touched by all that the NPS and later NPC had to offer and all that it was, and they really did form part of its legacy that we are so fortunate to be able to talk about now and learn from. So I hope you got a little bit out of all of this jabbering about different people who are at the seminary. I don't know, Bonnie, if there are any questions or if anybody just wants to ask anything now. I have no doubt that I won't know the answer, but that Frank will.
I should, Anne, it's a nice segue, also a nice bookend again, is to use the phrase you used earlier. One of the gracious things that Ambassador Roy Tasco Davis did when he took over as president, knowing that Catherine Munford, because she was still there, knowing that Catherine Munford was a devout Methodist and had taught Bible literature, he named the chapel the Munford Chapel. At the same time, he named the library the Charlotte Priest Library.
Exactly.
Well, I don't see any questions in the chat room, and I wonder if anybody present and watching has any questions that they want to ask or comments they want to make of Frank or Ann. Please unmute yourself and feel free to jump in.
Hi, this is Erin. I'll just jump in. First of all, thanks for the presentation. That was great. I don't know if you could go back to the slide that just showed basically, I think the job titles of the different faculty. It was really towards the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
The 1912 one is a good.
Like here or back one more?
Back one more, two more, one more.
Oh, go to the one you first showed me.
No.
I think there was a Mistress of Games. I thought that was a big title.
Yeah, it was part of the PE, the gym program. And I suspect it was related to, they would have a field day every year where they had to compete in different types of events. And I think the Mistress of Games was in charge of like scorekeeping and I mean, obviously organizing, but I think she was the person who, you know, kept the records for the school of who won what event, because they would compete, each sorority would compete, or, you know, a set of sororities would compete against another set of sororities. So, and years, the junior year versus the senior year, that kind of thing.
My
So-
spreadsheet didn't cover this year, but I concluded that that's not faculty, just like at the very bottom of that page, the gymnasium accompanist, Elizabeth Benedict. I think the supervisor of study and the supervisor of practice I treat as faculty, but the gymnasium accompanist who's playing music while the gym students do their stuff, but is not actually teaching the gym class, I decided was not faculty.
I would agree with that.
Right.
And
If
could
you go
you,
back a little bit further on this same one, you know, Anne, that's got, it shows Partington, Priest, and Munford in their respective
Sure.
roles.
I think Aaron had another
No, I'm sorry, there they are.
question.
yeah, could you just explain more what voice culture is? Is that singing or other?
It is. I think it was purely the name they gave for voice, for vocal training. I don't think, you know,
It's part of the
singing.
music, as part of the music faculty. I think that's right.
Yeah.
They had a separate set of studies called elocution. And that was, and forgive me, this is where we get into the politically incorrect language of the time. The thought being that a woman should have a deeper voice than she might otherwise have, and you should cultivate speaking in a deep voice. You learn to sing as well, but and vocal culture in that sense, but also elocution and acting and all of that was in part to help train women to speak, to lower their voices, lower in pitch.
I have a question. I know it is probably difficult to find information about all these faculty members. How did you, like I see Leon Vincent, and I've seen his name a lot, and so I just wondered, did you choose to only focus on those you could find information in a certain amount of time?
Well, Bonnie, you're stealing a bit of thunder here, but thank you for that. Actually, there are some folks who, the people we talked about were to some extent those that we had ready information on. We knew we had letters from them in the archives, and some of them, we just knew that they were well loved and well respected at the school. We knew their names. And there are 3 other folks who were associated with the school who we decided not to talk about, who were actually quite famous in their day. Leon Vincent is one of them. And we were thinking of doing a separate talk on them because there's so much information about them, we couldn't fit it in. And the 3 people were interestingly not permanent faculty. They were more like guest lecturers, and you'll see Leon is listed as a lecturer on English literature. He was sort of, I think he went around kind of like a circuit and gave his lecture series, and he was one of them. Yehu DeWitt Miller, whose library, some of whose books were kept here at the seminary, and who was also a visiting lecturer / minister, was the second one. And the third would be, what's his name?
Francis Wilson.
Francis Wilson, correct, the actor, who donated his costumes to the school. And so he had a relationship with the school. All 3 of them did. And they were known as sort of a collection of intellects. They were all friends, and they were all friends with Cassidy. And I believe they were friends with the architect who designed the buildings at National Park Seminary. So we need to do a little more research on them, but we know a lot about those 3 individuals, not necessarily how they are all related to National Park Seminary, though. So I already started collecting slides, and I have some great images because Francis Wilson was an actor. There are a lot of images of him in costume. So it could be a really fun talk.
Oh, good.
So does that answer, Bonnie? I may have gotten off topic.
No, that's perfect, because that's a great segue into another program.
Right.
Yes, those names, those three names I've heard for years. So, and like you said, there's probably, because they were so well known, there's much more information about them. So that's great. That's great.
There's so, and I'll just yell if I'm off topic. There's just so many different ways to unpeel this onion. It was extremely, Anne will tell you, it was very painful for me not to be able to include Leon and Vincent this time, but I agreed. But there's also, you've got people like John Porter Lawrence, who was probably the most prominent piano teacher in the Washington area of his day, who was, as I said earlier, you got new piano teachers every year, but there he is. John Porter Lawrence was there on the first year and the head of the sort of piano section until his death in 1918. He's a really important guy. And but Anne, I think, was right that the Caspars are more interesting and more important for today's topic, but Lawrence would have been a good choice. There's Lela Grace Woodward, who was the art teacher and the head of the art department, who also came in 1907 at the same time as Partington and Munford, and was teaching students art and drawing through 1931, and who I happen to have met her great niece, who showed me a postcard where Ms. Woodward had put an X at the spot where she lived, which was one of the rooms in the left tower of the villa where she lived for many years. That's a fun person to try to talk about. So there's just lots of them. There's just so many interesting people. It's hard to say. I was glad that we decided to go with the people who were probably the heart of the school, that made central contributions to the school or revealed something interesting about the way the school worked in the early days, that sort of thing. But we could have had all sorts of other people.
Right. Well, that's it. Just I just found it fascinating what you did reveal, because it just it gives us a greater understanding and sense of the feeling or atmosphere of the school and what it was really like in those days. Starting with living out of a suitcase.
Well, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That was the idea. That was why I wanted to do Madeira, was to get that in. Yeah.
It's amazing. Just amazing.
And then she ends up being one of the most prominent women educators in American history.
Right. So, great. Well, wonderful. Well, if there aren't any more questions, just a reminder to everyone that this will be is being recorded and will be posted on our website. So if you know other people who might be interested, certainly direct them to our website. Oops, I see a question from Tula. Okay, one of our resident members says, "Thank you, Anne, Frank, and Bonnie. Another great discussion. Thanks, Tula. Glad you could attend."
Thank you, Tula.
And we appreciate.
Hey, Bonnie?
Yes.
Would it be of interest for me to finally put the spike in the whole idea of Charlotte Priest being the first faculty member hired?
Put a spike in. Well,
No.
I should
I've heard that story.
I'll let
No.
that go. Huh? Yeah. All right.
yeah.
Well, it took me forever to figure out who the source of that lie was.
Mm.
It was quite funny that it turned out to be John Cassidy himself.
Okay, well, we can blame him then.
It's the first sentence in his funeral oration.
That's right. Okay.
Good.
Right. Well, good. Well, thank you again. Oops, Anne, Anne Hall, you raised your hand.
Well, I have a question. Not what faculty would have taught. What are the names of the faculty or the courses which were at the model home when they learned to kind of run a home?
Oh, home economics.
Oh, yeah,
The
that
domestic
economics,
department.
is that
The
a-
domestic
did they call-
department. Yeah.
Domestic department.
domestic
home ec.
department. Yeah, I don't know if it's on this
No.
set of pages or not.
No, I
Yeah.
don't think so. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was they called it a department.
That became a much bigger deal during the Mint years, in part because they were so flush with cash, they could do a lot of other stuff. They were always teaching home ec, that had been invented by, who was it? Elizabeth Swallow, good Lord, I've forgotten her married name, Robinson, the first person to get a PhD woman who invented the study of home economics. And the seminary schools took it on in a very big way. But here, because the school was able to rent the Bremer House, and they used it as the staging area for all of those courses, it was really a very elaborate program. But I don't have a name, I don't have a name in my head of who was in charge of that. And it was out of the scope of this talk because it's during the immense years that was a big piece of the puzzle, a big piece of the educational program.
It's later. Mhm. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you,
That's an-
everybody, for coming.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Attendees.
I'm gonna say goodnight
Okay,
and see you all next time.
okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Great job, guys. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Anne.